Hey, Jeremy. It's great to see you.
Hey, so glad to be entering this conversation with you, Andrea.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for doing it. So, I want to start kind of on a personal note because I'm really interested in how you came to write these books and the way you developed sort of your knowledge base to write them. And I know, I know a little bit about you. I kind of wonder, I guess, first question is, were you an early sort of seeker? Were you looking for something different?
It's interesting because the answer is sort of both yes and no in a way. Because during my teens, I was absolutely a seeker. And I was completely, even from my early teens onward, I was just rejecting the whole sort of world I was brought up in Northwest London, in the suburbs where I lived. I just knew there was something so much bigger. And I was an undergraduate student at Cambridge. And I totally rejected the whole ivory tower thing along with that. And I was living in a squat with anarchists from Italy and stuff. And I felt myself to be really a rebel looking for something else. But then my life took an unexpected turn because I, I left England as part of that. I just wanted to, it just seemed like this kind of place stuck in the past. I grew up in a particular niche in England. I grew up in a Jewish family, which in England is different from Jewish sort of minority in the US in the sense that from a young child onward, I got taught to really keep a low profile, as if we were sort of there on sufferance and should be grateful, like other people from that same generation of my parents were ones who died in concentration camps or whatever in Europe. So there was a sense like just keep a low profile. And I hated that. I just wanted to shed all of that. And that was part of why I came to the States. But ironically, I came to the States primarily because I was entranced by films of Woodstock and hippies, and I wanted to go explore, open my mind. But then I met somebody who became my first wife. She passed away some years back now, but she had been a hippie and she traveled all over South America. And to me, it was like iconic. This is the stuff that's going to open my mind. But the strange thing was that she, in her words, wanted to go straight. Like she had two sons who became my stepsons. And she had, in her mind, she'd figured that she wanted to give them the best start in life, which meant going back into the mainstream, giving them the conventional education, and then let them go where they would go. And so I went with that. And I did a complete, almost like a U-turn in my life. I got an MBA at the University of Chicago, went into consulting, started a business during the first internet.com phase back in the 90s. And was very successful in it. Actually founded a company, got the top tier venture capital funding, took it public as a CEO.
Wow. It's an exciting time.
It was both exciting and bizarre because I felt it wasn't me. And yet there was an energy, you just sort of go with the flow. And like,
it's very interesting to think of you coming in a certain spirit and falling in love, because that's a big word too. We'll get to it later, but falling in love. And then it's almost that kind of yin yang between the two of you in a way. You sort of saw what you wanted in her and she in you. And then, but it seems that you needed stability at the time. So it went towards that, but you hadn't really, sounds like you hadn't really played out that other energy at all.
That's completely right. I had not really fulfilled what I felt as I look back, where my sort of being really wanted to grow into. And I felt that even in those times, I felt like I was putting stuff in abeyance, waiting for it to come back.
It sounds similar to the childhood thing of keep it all quiet and just go along with things and
I think that's what I was. Yeah, and I think that's really part of my own personality traits, is that tendency to do that, which I did it exactly in that way. But then what happened to me is my wife at the time, her name was Molly, she got very sick from different things from her earlier from her earlier past. And I left the company to look after her full time. I left the company when it was too early and it was immature. And then the company crashed within a year or two. But then I got embroiled in all the fallout from that. And meanwhile, Molly, as she got to be very sick, she ended up going through years of sort of borderline dementia. And while I was looking after her, I really had lost the person I had really was my closest contact in life. So I felt like everything I'd built in my life had crashed around me. And it was a traumatic, it was really a terrible time for me. And there was years of like purgatory when I felt very much on my own, looking after this person who was only sort of half there. And it for me became a crucible where I determined whatever I do with the rest of my life was going to be something that was truly meaningful, where I wasn't taking meaning from somebody else. In this case, from Molly and her experience, or from some guru telling me that believe in this. I wanted to really believe in it and cognitively really understand and be convinced in my intellectual mind that something's right. At the same time, really be there with my heart and spirit, really live that meaning. And so I started to search for that. And I wanted to peel the onion, if you will, like whatever concepts we take for granted, like wherever we are in life, whether it's God or soul or a human difference from the rest of nature or whatever. I wanted to understand where these ideas came from, really get to the bedrock. And that's what led me to end up doing the research that led to that book called The Patterning Instinct.
Were you reading a lot during this time? Or this sounds like a really excruciating moment.
Yeah.
And first, before we get there, did you meet her in New York? Because I also wanted to ask you, I feel like you just sort of arrived in New York from London, and I think you came across the Tao there, and I'm wondering, like, were all these things connected, or?
Great question. I did land in New York when I first came to the States, and I always felt a real sense of love for New York, but also that it wasn't quite for me. It was too hectic and hustle and bustle. Yeah. And I decided I wanted to go to where my childhood imagery of where minds got expanded was in California.
That's the hippie place, right?
Exactly. And then
the counterculture.
Some sort of later lame version of Jack Kerouac on the road.
I was thinking of the beats, in a way. I was completely thinking of that.
Totally. So I actually hitchhiked my way across the US words of Lou Reed, I think it is. And thought I was so cool doing that. But I was really just very innocent and naive in those days too. I was quite, just young, just 21 years old. And so it was actually getting dropped off by a ride as I was hitchhiking in Berkeley, California, which is interestingly where I live now, decades later, which was actually where I met Molly, who then became my wife later on. So I was actually in Berkeley that I met her. So to answer your question, during that really difficult period of these years of purgatory, yes, basically, other than caring for Molly, my primary time, my days were spent reading, just absolutely voraciously. And that's because when in that early seeking time in my teens, I really had never come across other spiritual traditions or any kind of deep wisdom tradition, like from East Asia or whatever. So I didn't really know what I was looking for. And then over the years I was doing business, I barely read a book for years. The most I was too busy, and I'd read business articles and magazines, but that was about it. And then I suddenly just dove in, and I'd read a book and it would raise questions. And what I was trying to do, really wanted to understand things. So if a book was convincing on one critique or one particular perspective, I would then look for the best book I could find that was on the other side of that. So I could really not just get stuck in emotive thinking, but really kick the tires of everything. And when I found a book that led me into new pathways, I'd just eat up the footnotes and look at the most significant sources and then go directly to those. So it was like sort of piecing together a jigsaw puzzle and just looking, sort of a little bit like a meta level detective work. So it took me from ideas like in modern philosophy, if you will, to history, and then ancient history, and then cognitive science, and then cognitive anthropology, and then evolutionary biology, and then understanding like different sort of cosmologies of systems thinking versus reductionism. And that was just a really rich time for me in that research. And at the same time I was doing that, I was really looking for the book that I ended up writing. I was looking for a book that could be a guide for me, trying to understand how all these different pieces fit together. And then it occurred to me at some point, well, maybe I could actually write this myself. And so my own notes for myself became notes for a book. But at the same time, it was also leading me to, if that book, The Patterning Instinct, was more like a history of looking at how we got to the way the world is right now and our way of thinking right now, I also began to piece together my own way of making sense of it and more integrative sense. And that was what became the more recent book called The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe, which really was what I did do in those years. I did integrate like hardcore science and spiritual traditions in the best way that I could. And that did lead me to come up with a way of making sense of our place in the universe in a way that feels very meaningful to me. And that's what I really wanted to share with others who are interested in these kind of
Yeah,
pathways.
it's interesting to me because as you were talking, there's a kind of pattern, right? Pattern is an important word in your work, and these kind of resonating patterns. So I still can't quite see it totally clearly, but there's something about your youth and things being a little bit extreme, feeling one way and acting another way or something. And then also this movement of going to a completely different country. There's something about that that makes one have to step on the other side in a sense, look at things differently. And then we already talked about your wife and stuff. So it's interesting to me that you were already looking at science and spirituality because I guess, we'll get to it in your books, both of them, but especially the last one. You're really integrating all of these things that we've thought of as dichotomies as, you're either scientific or you're spiritual.
Right.
But it sounds like you were already trying to bridge that.
No, it's a good point. I think, yeah, there was something in me during that crucible period that I was talking about where I just wanted to find something that could truly be alive for all the different parts of me. And that was what a lot of that search was, like saying, no, I don't accept following one path which doesn't fulfill another part of me. Maybe it's because that first part of my life, I did feel big parts of me were not getting fulfilled. And so I didn't want that to happen again.
Yeah.
And to
So you
your
wanted to open the space so it could all be okay there.
exactly. I wanted every part of me to feel it had a place in my own way of experiencing life. And to your point about patterns, I do think that was crucial for me. And of course, that first book I wrote is called The Patterning Instinct, because I got to realize through my work in cognitive science and evolutionary biology that actually that is what makes humans unique among other mammals, that we have this very highly advanced prefrontal cortex, more advanced, more developed than any other mammal. And it's that prefrontal cortex that allows us the sort of pattern meaning into things. And that does that for other mammals too, but we do it to such a degree that it creates almost, well, not almost, like I say, as really a different form of consciousness that I call conceptual consciousness.
Versus animate consciousness, that's the other one.
Consciousness, exactly, which perhaps we can come to at some point. But
yeah.
but the thing I want to say about patterns is what I began to realize is the interesting thing about patterns. What a pattern does is it takes what would otherwise be sort of random spots, like spots of data or spots of light or color or whatever it might be, and it kind of creates a coherence in that by connecting certain of those spots together in a way that forms a shape that we can then make sense of. But equally importantly, what it does is it eliminates, it ignores those spots or bits of data that aren't part of that pattern. So if you look up at the stars in the sky, basically every human culture, I think, all the way back from prehistory, and found constellations, and they gave them names and they put myths or whatever around those constellations. But when you think about what a constellation does, it says these stars are important, maybe they're a bit bright or whatever, and the other ones you stop seeing. And because of our patterning instinct, once we begin to see things according to a pattern, we begin to ignore those that don't fit into the pattern. So the pattern itself becomes like a lens where it distorts the world or sort of shapes meaning for us into how we see things, which could be a very valuable way of seeing things. I'm not saying that in itself is bad, but it does mean that there are other things that might be available to our sensory experience that we stop seeing. And that's one of the ways in which I saw how over history, what different cultures have done is they formed patterns of meaning about the universe. But by doing that, they also ignored other patterns of meaning that were available. But it's something we don't usually realize. And to me, there's something liberating in recognizing that, because as you begin to see that our worldview, whatever worldview it is that we have, or our dominant worldview that we're part of, when you begin to see it's actually a lens, is a particular lens of understanding the universe, it liberates us to start to explore for other lenses or other ways of making sense.
Yes, I think there's two things in there I want to draw out a little bit. First, the PFC and what you said is all true, but it also, as you do point out in your work too, that it allows us to become aware of patterns, which is something a bit different from other forms of life in a way, or we can notice patterns in life, let's say. It's like life noticing its own patterns, which is kind of remarkable. And in that way, we can maybe start to change them. So there's this very powerful thing that happens, but worldview is the other word that's very important. I want to try to understand how you set out to write this first book. We'll just spend a little time, but because it's a sort of cognitive history, which is a little bit unusual to think about history through cognitive patterns as you've sort of just explained them in a way. As you're talking, I'm thinking, okay, we're born into this blooming, buzzing confusion, so to speak, as little kids. And of course, the body has to make sense of that. I mean, we think about evolution, and over time, all these bodies have been making sense of all that encounter. And you do develop patterns in order to survive. You can look at it evolutionarily, how we've developed patterns so as to survive. And you show in your book that those patterns are similar. There's a lot of statistical regularities around the world. We all live on the same earth. There's certain things we all share, but they're also very different according to language, for example. I mean, language itself kind of co-develops in this way, but then of course it becomes like an external representation of it. So these ways that we've developed over time, there's many different ways of being in the world, in the same world, but we don't, as you were saying, I think there's a kind of blindness, right? We don't realize that we can all see the world from such different points of view.
I agree. I think what you're saying makes a ton of sense. And maybe it's a good point right here to introduce this notion of animate intelligence along with another form of conceptual intelligence. Exactly. Because to what you're saying about how basically all mammals, or basically
just life, really. Anything that's making its way.
Form of life, exactly. It doesn't have to be even an animal that has a brain, is working according to patterns. and to your point, that's really one of the great intelligences of life itself from the very earliest days, that those connections between molecules that actually work then actually get reinstantiated in the next generation of whatever entity that is. And it's as though, there's this great concept that only very recently evolutionary biologists has come to think about, that evolution itself learns. Like evolution itself is like a force that has intelligence, and that by things that work and things that don't work, evolution itself actually becomes more sophisticated in what it does. But life has maintained so many of those patterns that work in shared DNA, which is why, we share big portions of our DNA with entities that we think of ourselves completely different from, like plants, or even more like simpler organisms, not to mention the vast amount that we share with other mammals. And those are the different patterns of the intelligence within an ecosystem. Ecosystems themselves are considered to have memories. If you look at the whole ecosystem as this complex interconnectivity of all these different patterns of behaviors. So that's really what we as living entities inherit as our animate intelligence. But then this notion of conceptual intelligence, I think a great way to get at it from the way that you were just describing things, is a whole field of thinking that really got started by George Lakoff and other people in that field of cognitive linguistics that I'm sure you're familiar with. And to me, when I came across his books, he wrote a simple book, Metaphors We Think By, which is just a real simple, easy introduction. And then he wrote a lot thicker terms to go into in more detail. but it just blew my mind. This was early on in my whole sort of research project.
Mm.
And just for people who don't know his work, in real simple terms, what he basically says is that that what that animate intelligence is that we were just talking about, he was showing how as infants, or maybe evolutionarily as pre-linguistic hominids, we had feelings. We had a sense of warm and cold, or a sense of high and low, or a sense of near and far, or a sense of big and small. And those are our embodied experience, shared. Basically, every human being has a very similar sense of those fundamental ways
almost like shared regularities in a way.
Yes, right. Shared regularity, a great way of saying it. And what he described is how though he doesn't use the term conceptual consciousness, but that's basically what he was describing. But with that PFC mediated level of consciousness, we then use those embodied experiences as scaffolding to create symbolic thinking. And so what he shows is that all these concepts that we think of as intangible concepts, whether we're talking about infinity or mathematics or any kind of philosophical, any abstract concept, you can barely say a sentence or two in normal language without coming up with some sort of abstract concept. But what he shows is that in every case, it comes from an embodied scaffolding when we use a big word. So if I'm saying to you about a conversation I had yesterday, and I say, "Oh yeah, she gave me a warm smile." You know what I mean, but you also know that she didn't actually give me something, and the smile she gave didn't like raise the temperature in the room, but I perceived it as well. And so that is key to understanding human sort of cognition. But what I did in the patterning instinct was then apply that to cultures, which is something that some people in cognitive linguistics do that, but I've never seen it done as explicitly. And that was almost like the foundation of cognitive history of this idea in the patterning instinct, recognizing that cultures themselves take their embodied existence and they will put a metaphor, a core metaphor for the universe in that sense making, which then will have entailments and implications, just like these scaffoldings have in all the way we think about things. So if you're a hunter-gatherer and you think that nature is a giving parent, you'll naturally see all other living beings as family because nature's your parent. Whereas if you are if you're living in an agrarian civilization and you see all these hierarchies around you, and the metaphor that's gotten created is seeing the gods as this kind of hierarchy of the gods, it makes sense that just like you've got to kneel down and pay obeisance to the big chieftain who comes into the village, similarly you have to like kneel down and pray to that big god and sacrifice something to hope that he'll look nicely on you. Very different way of looking at the universe based on the sort of lived metaphor and the lived experience of your society.
There's some stuff in there I want to unpack a little bit or dig around in, because the book sort of lays out these different worldviews, and you see that each one of them does have this sort of root metaphor to it. And just by showing that, it kind of shows, well, okay, obviously there's some teleology here, or some search for meaning, not teleology like a final purpose, but I think you use the word more like a search for purpose or meaning, not necessarily a final one at all. Just there's some way in which the survival of whatever culture is benefited by feeling like they have meaning or purpose.
Yes, I think that's true. And I think that, and really that's what I mean by that title, the patterning instinct. My kind of thesis, I guess, if you will, is that that's highly developed prefrontal cortex. It didn't develop in order to find meaning. It developed in order to optimize people's lives in a highly complex social environment that hominids found themselves in after the Great Rift Valley split, as we evolved over millions of years away from our primate shared ancestors. So it didn't evolve because we were trying to find meaning. But what evolved in us was this instinct to make sense out of complex things around us. And those who did that most successfully, the ones who were most successful in those hominid communities. But that kept going, that instinct. So basically, that's the instinct that drives us to find meaning. And when we find meaning in things, it makes us feel good. there's a sort of aha, a sense of satisfaction that we get. And we feel at home and we feel secure when we sense that what we're doing has coherence and there's meaning to it. And that's why people are so willing to like latch onto a sense of meaning that they inherit from their culture, or maybe they find through their own path. And whatever it is, if it might be believing in a particular god, or it might be have a whole set of rituals around that really compromise other elements of their life, but they're ready to just do that because it gives them that sense of being at home in the universe in a way that they can feel.
It's definitely an embodied experience. Do you think that the resonance itself is a kind of meaning in terms of just this process? And you do describe it in a kind of systems thinking approach. So there's this sort of spiraling or looping. It's not really a loop, doesn't come back to where it started, but there's this movement in which the way that we're patterning and aligning with the world and making sense of it, surviving, that somehow that way, that itself, the resonance of that, it felt like to me you were saying that is the meaning. Like an animal would sort of have this sense of animate meaning, not conceptual meaning, in the sense of wanting to continue those patterns in a certain way. And then if you sort of scale that up through external representation and into concepts of language, we're sort of still doing the same thing. Just like we might develop patterns with our family that are very meaningful, but we're not necessarily thinking about them, but we want to keep those. And if we break them, or if something happens to them, it's a loss of meaning for us.
Yes, I agree with you. And in the book, The Web of Meaning, I end up kind of defining meaning, in fact. And I thought a lot about this because it's not a term, well, it's a term that when people do define it, it's usually fits within the worldview of wherever they're defining it from. And so it actually is not a term that is easy and is clear to define. And I ended up seeing meaning itself as a function of connectedness. It's an emergent phenomenon, in fact, just like life itself is an emergent phenomenon, or consciousness is an emergent phenomenon. Basically, it's something, and for people not familiar with systems thinking or whatever, basically we can think of an emergent phenomenon as something that arises from a very, very complex set of interconnections in a self-organized system, that from that deep complexity, a certain new level arises that actually can sometimes look simpler, but it's really emergent from the incredible complexity that comes underneath
like
it.
Birds moving together in the sky or something like this. Is easy image of it. Although actually our bodies are doing it all the time, as you show. There's this kind of fractal, depending on where you're looking at it, it either makes sense or it looks like emergence, I guess. But
right, exactly. Right. Or I mean, basically any body that's moving in space, and you look at it, and it could be a single bird or a human just walking.
It's incredible. Coordinated cells, like, wow, is that happening?
Basically, yeah, there's like 40 trillion cells all interacting, some dying and being born, and all this stuff happening at the same moment. And yet it seems so simple and elegant. And that's an emergent phenomenon. And meaning itself is like that. And so we can see meaning as almost like the network of relationships that we perceive, because meaning in that sense only arises. We have to create the meaning because we have to be part of this set of relationships where we are perceiving something and making sense of it. But at the same time, that doesn't mean, like the reductionist and somebody who's a fundamentalist reductionist will say, well, right, that's what I'm saying. There is no meaning in the universe. It's utterly meaningless. And we just make up our meaning like it's this fiction. And I would disagree with that. I'd say this is the whole point, is that there is no, that's one of these false dichotomies between what is just objective out there and what is subjective. That actually the reality is that we are always engaged in enacting our consciousness. We are engaged in enacting life. We are engaged in enacting meaning in a way that there is no separation between the subject and the object in that sense. And meaning is very much like that. And so what you're saying makes sense in the sense that we could, to think of non-human mammals who have a prefrontal cortex, they're making a ton of meaning out of things.
Yeah, there's meaning to animals' lives, but it's not conceptual. You could just think of it as this resonance. You talk about music a lot in the books, and
Yes.
there's something about the kind of harmony or the, these words that you use, I think that applies to all levels of
Mm.
mind or intelligence. But then once we add concepts and language, that's where the meaning gets tricky because then we're talking about it and we're putting it into these very conceptual forms, which, as you just said, those differ very much depending on how you've developed, where you've developed all this.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so yeah, those do very much differentiate. And I do absolutely agree with you that we should see elements like meaning or consciousness or any of these in terms of a spectrum. And having said that, that spectrum is not necessarily a linear spectrum. It's not like, I mean, there are certain jumps that happen. And evolutionary terms, the jump that happens, say when animals develop a nervous system in evolutionary biology. There's a certain jump that happens when warm-blooded mammals evolve, and there's a jump that happens when humans evolve. So in each case, there are kind of jumps in that level of consciousness or meaning making that takes place, but that doesn't mean that there is one point at which there is and isn't, but it's very much a spectrum.
Right.
Yeah.
And this linear thing, I think, is really hard to get out of. I don't know exactly how to get into this. You were already talking a little bit about the paradox and this kind of dichotomy and so on, but thinking of it cognitively, like you sort of tell a cognitive history, and then we're thinking now about mind being almost just life, continuous with life in the universe, developing in different ways. But why does it get so tricky at some point that we start to only talk about it as if it's mental or only conceptual? What is
Yeah.
it why do we forget this whole animate? Why do they
Right.
become two things? Why isn't it seen as a continuity rather than, oh, we were animate and now we're conceptual? It's not like that. We're always both.
Yeah.
But yeah, how have you sort of dealt with that?
Well, I think, yeah, you're asking a crucial question. And I think what's important to understand is that distinction itself is a function of a particular worldview, which is
Yeah.
basically the modernist worldview that developed really in early modern Europe around the time of the scientific revolution. And until then, there there was in the Western tradition a dualistic split that was a precursor of that modern worldview, which itself is very different from other worldviews. So if you look at East Asian worldview, they don't see that distinction that to us it seems so obvious between mind and body, or whatever. Well, they might now because the dominant worldview has infiltrated other cultures so powerfully now
Yeah.
for many generations. But if you look at traditional Chinese thought, absolutely, they just simply don't see that distinction. And actually, when they tried to essentialize what is there that's different between humans and other mammals, they actually didn't look at the conceptual animate split. They actually looked at a split of morality. They actually viewed humans are different than other animals because we sort of have a moral compass around what we do. And so that's just really interesting to see how you could look at that in a completely different way. And of course, indigenous cultures around the world never saw that split. They saw incredible intelligence all around them. But the split, in my view, began with dualistic thought, which can be traced all the way back to even before Plato. But that's a little bit hazy, like Proto-Indo-European thought and things like that. But the first obvious kind of spokesperson for dualism was Plato. And he did a great job of putting out a cosmology that was a dualistic cosmology, where basically you had this eternal truth in some other domain and the world itself, this pale imitation of trying to be that perfect goodness. And along with that split universe, he saw a split human being. He saw basically a soul that connected us to divinity and a body that the soul was imprisoned in. And basically the soul being in the body was like the death of the soul. So when the body died, it freed the soul to go back to that perfection. And that led to a very much rejection of the body and of worldly stuff, as if the mind itself and that abstract prefrontal cortex mediated conceptual consciousness was what connected us with divinity. So reason became divine. And that led to a rejection of bodily experience very different from what was happening in East Asia at the time with the rise of Taoism and
Mm-hmm.
Confucianism.
I have to push at you on this though, because as I was reading your book, first of all, I wonder when did you, it seems like mostly you're interested in Chinese thought. So I wonder if that's true or and where that came from. But also, as you point out in the book, there's still this proclivity to put things in twos. You know, if it's Juve or Vuve, the two like yin yang,
Oh,
but then you talk
Wu,
about the
Wu,
two
Wu Wei,
Juve.
Yu Wei,
Yeah.
right?
There's always
Yes,
two,
Wu
right?
Wei,
I mean, I
yes,
think
right.
part of me is trying to say
Yes,
there's a
yeah,
way in which, just as the prefrontal cortex, as we were saying, allows us to become aware of our patterns, there is something about
yes,
oppositioning things that
yeah,
actually is helpful and that we always
right,
do, but we start to take it as
yes,
reality somehow. And that's the
yeah.
tricky thing. How do we
Yeah.
understand that's a tool and there's
Mhm.
never just two? Like you could actually turn from any one and find in systems thinking, for example, numerous nodes and other twos, right? So every
Mhm.
one has like a multitude of twos, but
Yes.
still
No,
we think of it in this
I hear you.
dualistic term.
And this is a really interesting concept, actually. And again, something as I was researching this, I thought about this myself a lot. And there's an important distinction to be made between between polarity and duality. And
Okay.
so when we look at, say, traditional Taoist or traditional Chinese thought, like you say, absolutely, they look at yin and yang, and yin is more like the sort of dark or the wet or the more mysterious, and yang is the bigger and maybe brighter and drier, whatever. So they make all these distinctions between yin and yang. So you say, oh, well, isn't that like Plato making distinction between perfection and the worldly, or good and bad, or and what I became convinced by, and a lot of different Chinese scholars have shown this, is there's a different quality.
Mm,
When you look at a polarity, you recognize that the two opposites actually need each other to complete the whole. And it's
mm,
not like one is good or one is bad, but that is actually very much the way the world works. And
mm,
we see that in magnetism. You have
yeah,
a plus and a minus,
sure.
and you have a North Pole and the South Pole. That doesn't mean the North Pole is good and the South Pole is bad.
Right.
And you can't have a North Pole without a South Pole, because they're by definition, they create each other
Mm-hmm.
in creating that whole. And so that's the notion of yin and yang, or
Mm,
other of these kind of ways in which traditional Chinese thought made these splits. Whereas with the dualistic thought in the West, it was very different from that. It was like there's good and there's bad, or good and
mm,
there's evil. And there's perfection and divinity, and there's
mm. You make
polluted
a
world.
choice. They're not
Yeah,
connected somehow.
exactly. And then
Okay.
there's conflict. So rather than the opposites being actually having the potential to harmonize with each other, to fulfill a whole,
Mm,
the opposites are in conflict with each other. So then when
mm,
Christianity inherited these ideas from
mm.
Plato, you have people like Paul, St. Paul, talking about how, this horrible, terrible battle that goes on within him between his desire for sexual satisfaction and this, he hates that lust his body has.
Yeah, fight against it. This whole metaphor
Yes,
of the
he said,
fight, the
like,
battle.
he can tell, and he wants to go to heaven, and he has to
Mm-hmm.
kill that part of himself. So it leads to this very, very conflictual way
Mm.
of understanding
That's very
things.
helpful to think of it in that way. But it still is a little confusing because with the Juve and
Wu Wei,
Vuve, it's
Wu
like
Wei.
flow. Vuve is kind of flow, right? It's kind of this graceful, effortless
Yes.
presence. And then you have the other one, which is action,
Yu Wei.
purposeful action.
Yeah.
And they
Purposeful
do
act.
seem to be different, like contrasting, but
Yes, I
yeah.
agree with you.
Mm,
And that's actually where I think the traditional Taoists did make a moral judgment,
mm,
basically, where they said Wu Wei, which is like sort of basically effortless flow with nature, that's good. And that kind of connects us with the Tao. And that's what other animals have naturally. But the humans, basically, they looked at what we're calling in this conversation conceptual consciousness, that pre-PFC mediated consciousness. They called that Yu-Wei thinking, like purposive action, saying,
mm-hmm,
I want to achieve this. And they said that's what civilization did. It took us away from the Tao and this kind of bad. And what we want to do, the whole point of life, is to shed that and go back to Wu-Wei. that was kind of traditional Taoist thought. One of the reasons why I kind of fell in love with Neo-Confucian thought.
Mm-hmm.
I
More like
read
9th century or
is it basically about, well, yeah, about 10th
11th or
century, but actually all the way to the 15th century in terms of our Western timeline. But it was the Song Dynasty, like around 1000 AD kind of thing, was when it's at its peak. And what they did, they thought they were actually rejecting Taoism and Buddhism, which had become very, very powerful parts of Chinese culture. And they thought they were going back to Confucianism, and which is why they're called by the West Neo-Confucians, but they actually call themselves the school of the Tao, because they were trying to understand the Tao from a new perspective. But what they actually did, ironically, is they did this incredible integration of all three of these traditions into a comprehensive meaning-making ontology, which to me was so incredibly powerful because of its close alignment with what modern systems thinking has to say. But what's important about Neo-Confucian thought is that they almost like they went beyond that Taoist rejection of purposive thinking of Yue, and they came up with a way of looking at how humans can experience life that is really truly integrative. That it's almost like the Confucian part of that tradition was the one that said it's actually good to use your mind in that sort of more human way, and we can celebrate that, and society and morals and all these things are actually a good thing. And so they found a way of integrating that with the more traditional Taoist understanding of things. And they would focus a lot on that sense of embodied knowledge. They had a word like tiren, which basically means not just with your mind and not just with your body, but all through your mind and body. It's really a word we lack in the West because we don't have that way of thinking. The closest ever come, people who are sci-fi fanatics might know Robert Heinlein's work, and he uses word to grok something. This becomes sort of part of where sort of just common language, if you will. But the idea of grokking something is I really get it. I get it through my entire body. That was the idea of Tiran.
I think some of my favorite parts of the book are when you're talking about those ideas and some of those quotes, the Neo-Confucianism. But I was thinking also of T.S. Eliot, this quote that coming back to where you started and knowing it for the first time in the poem. And I'm wondering how you feel about, like, in this tradition, I don't think you're saying, let's go back and be Neo-Confucianists necessarily. I mean, we are where we are. And that's part of what you bring out in Web of Meaning, can move to that book, is it's not an either or, it's not reductionism or dualism. We can have both, but it's a different mindset or something. It's not that are we coming back to where we started and knowing it differently? And is this opposition somehow important for that?
Great question. Yeah, I love that. Well, I do think that there might be things that we can treasure from, say, early nomadic hunter-gatherer worldviews, or Neo-Confucian thought, or Taoist thought, or early Buddhist thought. But like you say, I feel strongly we need to recognize there was no golden age. In fact, even the Neo-Confucians, whose thought I thought was so valuable, very, very strongly patriarchal. In fact, the Neo-Confucian period was when foot binding first became predominant in Chinese culture. Just a horrendous torture of women going on through generations. So there's no way to look back at that and say, oh, we need to go back to that. But my core point, really, and this is really a big theme of the Web of Meaning, is that, well, maybe for starters, to recognize that our society right now, our global civilization, is on a very terrifying trajectory towards potential collapse, towards massive devastation to the world. We desperately need to come up with a different sense of meaning making, a worldview that could redirect us into a more positive direction. And so given the desperate need for that, it feels to me the best thing we can do is actually look for what are the greatest insights available from all the great treasure trove of human history and human experience, and see if there's a way we can integrate them in the best possible way to move forward. And to me, one of the most important breakthroughs I had when I was doing that kind of intellectual journey seeking that I described earlier was actually, it was almost like this kind of my own sort of aha moment when I was reading a lot of the stuff about Neo-Confucian thought and discovering this concept they had of Li. And the word Li in Neo-Confucian thinking basically means like the patterns of organization, the way in which all they make this, they say that qi basically is matter and or energy, all the stuff of the universe. And to them, Li is the ways in which all that matter and energy self-organizes in a way that causes things to be either earth or air or fire or human beings. It depends on the Li, the ways in which all the stuff is organized. And the Li was what they thought was most important. So as I was reading that, I was also coming across some of the greatest pioneers of looking at the implications of systems thinking in complexity science. One in particular was Stuart Kauffman, great thinker who's associated with the Santa Fe Institute, and just a brilliant person who melds together concepts in physics and biology and neuroscience. And he writes books like with titles like At Home in the Universe, looking at how when we look at the deep implications of complexity science, we find that the patterns between things are more important often than the things themselves. And that leads to new implications. And there's a point at which he's waxing very eloquent about this. And he goes, we're entering new territory. We're trying to make sense of a universe in a way that no one has been able to make sense of before. And he's right from the point of view of modern Western thought. But what he didn't have was that actually overlay of other traditions, such as Neo-Confucianism. And it was that moment I sort of began to realize, oh, the Neo-Confucians, when they were describing Li, were describing the very universe that Stuart Kauffman is describing. And they weren't doing it from a mathematical scientific standpoint, but they were doing it from the standpoint that actually integrated some of the great wisdom traditions of our human experience, of Buddhism and Taoism. And so that's what began to help me to realize that this distinction we make between science and spirituality is a false distinction. It's actually a distinction that arises from this modern dualistic worldview, rather than a distinction that is ontologically true or out there. And when we begin to look at the world from that systems perspective, we begin to see that we can actually embrace spiritual understanding without giving up that very rigorous systems scientific perspective. We can begin to see, as I do in the book, The Web of Meaning, I begin to, and I'm not trying to come up with a final definition of these things, but I come up with a way of we can use language to define spirituality from the perspective of systems science. And we can look at spirituality itself as really being like an approach of seeking meaning in the connections between things rather than the things themselves. And then we see these distinctions we made initially are just no longer valid.
Yes, I think that's wonderful. There's a point in the book, I think it's a quote, or maybe you write it too, where you say it's the connections between things, but also this idea that there's patterns. I think it's important that we can recognize the patterns, but no one pattern is ever the same.
Yes.
That there's this kind of, I think that's a very important point too. And to connect it to what you just said, it sometimes can feel like we're going, like we just want to embrace the spirituality too. And leave the science or leave the technology, for example, behind, because we can sort of think, oh, that's what's causing all this inertia. Because we don't have much more time, but I wanted to talk a little bit about motivation in this new ecological civilization, because I think about something like social media, or the way in the US or Europe, a lot of people are motivated to become famous or to become well known or to be liked. There's this motivation for attention. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is we could blame the technology for that. We could blame science for creating all these wonderful things. But you're not saying that either in the book. You're kind of saying, like, these patterns, we can look at them and they're unique, and we can find a new pattern emerging out of that. And the paradox is important, isn't it? This idea of conservation, innovation, resilience, flexibility. So that's hard, I think, for people to get. But
no, I think you're so right in that, Andrea. And I do think there's a couple of big points, ones to sort of touch on coming out from what you're saying. One is that notion you're saying about patterns not being fixed is crucially important. The word pattern, and the way I've described them in our earlier part of this conversation, gives a sense of fixed patterns, like a constellation or whatever.
Yeah. Almost
What
like a
is
train track you're on and you can't move it or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, exactly. But what's crucial to recognize in basically in any self-organized system and any form of life or any form of ways in which humans make sense of things, there actually are dynamic patterns. And these are what are called in system science, in complexity theory, attractors. An attractor actually has, depending on the kind of attractor, it basically means like points at which a complex system will settle. So from a physics point of view, a point attractor means like if you have a pendulum, it settles at one point, and that's what its attractor is. But when physicists started to apply their thinking to complex things of life, like ocean waves or any kind of living forms or how they work, they called them strange attractors because as they sort of began to pattern them out, they realized they never stayed in one place. There was like a pattern that would always be moving, but always be roughly within some sort of set of parameters. Like a simple way of understanding what they call a strange attractor is a candle flame. Like you can look at a flame of a candle and it's always changing, but it's not suddenly going to go into a blowtorch, and until you blow on it, it's not going to go out. It's going to stay relatively stable as long as the inputs allow it to. Or similarly, if you turn on a tap and look at the pattern the water makes before it goes down the drain, it's always changing once again, but it's kind of roughly predictable. So they call that a strange attractor. I came up with the term natural attractor because to me, they're not strange at all. They're only strange if you actually are looking for those linearities. The thing that's strange is that are not natural attractors. So, but it's those dynamic patterns that is actually how life works. And once we embrace that, it does help us to move from a fixed way of making sense of things to really opening up to this kind of unfolding set of patterns of the universe and recognizing our very way, anytime we make sense of something, the best thing we can do is then, having made sense of it, to let that go and accept the next experience that might slightly shift the way of making sense of it. Doesn't mean we throw out what we just made sense of. It just means it can be continually adapting and moving, which is a way of understanding the Buddhist notion of no self, which again is sometimes is, in my view, mistranslated as basically being no self, as if the Buddhists are saying there is no such thing as self. The very idea of self is a delusion. I think a more accurate way of looking at it is to say the very idea of a fixed self is a delusion. And what we tend to do as human beings is say, okay, this is a self. This is who I am. This is what I am. And that's fixed. And then dukkha or suffering arises when that is shifted at all. But once we embrace that
called
sense,
into question or threatened and all that.
Exactly. But once we embrace that sense that actually our very sense of self is a natural attractor, always moving, always shifting with life, always opening and closing, always adapting, then it kind of allows us to be much more open to what we're not necessarily expecting.
That's a wonderful point, and I think it's so crucial, and it's kind of what you're gifting with a web of meaning, but it's so subtle because we do come out of an inertia, and it is hard not to think of everything as solid and static and the self. And we didn't really get into it too much, but you sort of talk about the I and the self. And I guess maybe that's also a way in which these contrasts, instead of seeing them as only one and two, it reminds me of Varela's paper, Francisco Varela. You talk a bit about Santiago theory, I think, and Maturana, but he has this paper called Not One, Not Two. And it really is that. It's not one and not two, but there's some way in which contrast awakens us in the same sense of the PFC letting us become aware of ourselves. But then we can shift what a self is. It doesn't even have to be confined to the body, as you kind of show. There's a way in which you can start resonating with patterns that are beyond the body. And as you were talking, another point I think is very important for people to understand is you're very sure to say that there's no separation. We're not like sitting in a space as humans. We are all part of an ongoing movement or pattern. So anytime anything shifts in your body or anywhere, it's shifting everywhere. That's part of the systems thinking too.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
in that way, we kind of have access to change ourselves and our patterns.
No, I think that is so true, Andrea. And what you're saying leads on to a very, very important point that I think, yeah, maybe we can begin to close on. But I think it's so important to explore this in some depth, is recognizing that exactly what you're describing, recognizing that our own identity is deeply interconnected with everything else. It leads to a realization that when we're looking at what's going on in our global unfolding and what our civilization is doing, everything from climate breakdown, ecological destruction, incredible injustice and inequities from around the world among different people, we realize we're not separate from that either. Any of us who are in a place of privilege, economic privilege or racial privilege or whatever it might be, are in a place where we get to enjoy some of the benefits that only arise because of the oppression and destruction that has been taking place historically and is currently happening right now. And that leads to moral implications too, because once we do realize that deep interconnectedness, well, we can always choose to just close off our minds and our eyes to seeing it because it's inconvenient. And that's a moral choice we make. But if we want to really live into what it means to recognize our identity as being part of something so much greater, part of all of humanity, part of all life, then it leads us to actually want to engage in making a difference, in moving towards basically imagining like what a future could look like that was affirming to life, that we don't have to live in the civilization that actually arises from that same dualistic way of thinking that we were talking earlier, arises from the sense of a separate individual, like taking it, and that's what sort of neoliberal thought is about. Like it's good for an individual to like optimize for themselves at the expense of everybody else, and that's okay.
Yeah.
In fact, that's what we're meant to do. Or humans are separate from nature, and so let's extract everything we can from nature for our human benefit. Those are what happens when you look at the worldview in that dualistic split way. But when you look at the world in this more recognition of deep interconnectedness, then there's this possibility of exploring what would a civilization look like if it were based on that interconnectedness, based on actually trying to organize ourselves as human beings in a way that could set the conditions for all life to flourish. So that's, I think, what is so exciting when we actually take these sort of ontological ideas and apply them to things like politics and society.
And you show that in the book. It's a subtle and delicate and somewhat challenging shift, but it's also incredibly powerful to begin to see the world like that and how quickly things can change in different directions when we realize this connection. But just to close, I do want to ask, as you were talking, I was thinking, it's really hard to hold the space of the paradox. I keep coming back to that, or because you see somebody, for example, in media who seems to have gotten to where they are through that worldview that you just described of being the selfish gene. And then people think, oh, that's the only way, and that must be the way, because it's very hard to understand that it's not exactly how it looks from this position, and there's many different ways to see it. The systems view kind of opens the space and shows us, oh, just because it looks like it worked doesn't mean it did work. Also, as you show in your book, what is it working towards? Is that really what we want to choose? Because that's part of this acceptance of the worldview that you point out too, that we just assume that's the thing we want because everyone else wants it. We don't even question it. So I think to try to just close it out and really get to this ecological civilization, you talk a lot about cooperation and competition, and we're not trying to squelch capitalism and just completely like reject all of this stuff. We're trying to embrace it and open the space around it. And dance is a kind of way you talk about it so that we can start to see how to change these patterns and see them differently. It's in a way a cognitive shift, to go back to that. So maybe, I don't know if you could just talk a little bit about that just to close, of how you understand opening this space. I think it's the concept of integration that you really come
Yes.
to.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that what it has a lot to do with is really that, if you will, like the sort of search for true happiness in our lives, that we realize that as human beings, one of the things that we always are driven for, and basically, and something we share with other mammals, so I shouldn't make that distinction as human beings, but we want to feel better in our lives. We want to feel good. We want to feel happy. In Buddhist thought, they use the word dukkha to describe that sense of being dissatisfied with something and always wanting something more, and not being fulfilled by anything that we have right now. And something to recognize is that our modern consumer culture, if you will, has taken that very notion of that Buddhist dukkha and weaponized it, if you will, like to recognizing that companies, corporations, sort of capitalism itself thrives on everybody feeling dissatisfied. Mm-hmm. Because if you're dissatisfied, you need to work harder to buy more and to gain more status. So that, just to your point, so you can be better known on whatever, on Instagram or TikTok, or and then be wealthier and more powerful. And you see, and no matter where you are on it, you always want that next stage. And it's something that some social psychologists have a great name for it. They call it the hedonic treadmill. Mm-hmm. That once you're on that treadmill, no matter how fast, just like a rat on a wheel, no matter how fast you go, the treadmill forces you to go even faster and faster. And this is, I think, one of the great learnings that we can get from a deeper look at our own identities, a deeper exploration of that, is realizing that true happiness does not come from those kind of hedonic attainments. And in fact, Aristotle made this great distinction, which is interesting because some people might think I'm rejecting a traditional Greek thought, but I was talking about Plato. But in very many ways, Aristotle was more aligned with Neo-Confucian thought than he was with Plato, in fact. Mm-hmm. And he talked about this notion of the distinction between what he called hedonia, which is like that hedonic treadmill, wanting the next thing, or gaining pleasure from short-term things or from attaining things. And what he called eudaimonia, which we can really translate nowadays as more like fulfilling a sense of well-being. But he specifically saw eudaimonia as really any entity, could be a plant or an animal or a human being, basically on its own track to fully become what it's capable of, to fully fulfill its own potential as that unique existence. And that's very, very different from gaining the sort of hedonic attainments. Because in eudaimonia, we get this ability to really look into what is it that is truly what I, as a unique human being and as evolved human being, what is it that I actually want in life? And when you come from that place, it will lead you to a very different path in the choices you make than when you get sort of sucked into that hedonic treadmill way of thinking.
That's so good, because that goes back to that idea that every pattern is unique. And so if we think of each human as a pattern, which we are patterns of activity, and they're each unique, and it's not about fitting in the way that we've gotten stuck. I mean, it's just a little bit sad the way we've kind of gotten stuck in trying to get each other's attention and getting kind of stuck in trying to get likes or whatever. But what you're saying there, it's like, step back. That's okay. Think of it as kind of interesting, a game. I don't know. But actually, you're a unique pattern. And I think it's the question you ask, like, what is the sacred, precious strand that you'll weave into the web or something? It's kind of the ending of the book in a way. Yeah. And you've just before that talked about love, that in a way that sinking out of that system and realizing there's so many other systems you could be part of, and you are a unique system, you start to feel connected. You start to realize, oh, you're actually not separate. And that's kind of how you define love in the book, isn't it?
Exactly. I define love basically as the realization and embrace of connectedness. And that can be small bits of love, like as you walk down the streets and you just look at somebody and acknowledge their presence and you're connected with them. And that can be large love of deep connection with a soul partner, somebody you're spending your life with. And it can be realization of connected with the universe, a sense of unconditional love for all that is, that and you each of us are gifted to be able to experience by this miracle of this life. And so that simple opening up and embracing of our connectedness is really a pathway that can allow us to leave behind some of that dukkha, some of that suffering of that hedonic treadmill.
And then when we're doing this, we do start to move towards that ecological civilization in a way, because there's a different pattern that emerges. So thank you. It's been wonderful to talk to you. I guess just to come back to your beginning, we talked about your personal, it seems like you've really made a journey. So do you feel like you're now with these books, do you feel like you're getting close to this sacred, precious sort of strand that you're still probably an explorer, but when you look back at the excruciating time, like how does it strike you now?
Oh, yes. Well, really, I do feel extremely fortunate to really feel blessed in terms of this place that I'm in my life right now, where I have been very fortunate now to have a love partner that has given me the sense of like deep fulfillment, of really allowing me to pursue my own eudaimonia, to use that word we were talking earlier. And from the point of view of my life's trajectory, I'm feeling very much I'm on a path to that sense of being somewhat complete, if you will, because having written those two books, I feel what is really important, and the book I'm working on right now, is to look at this vision of an ecological civilization, look at this sense of what might be possible for a life-affirming civilization, and do whatever I can to try to help steer our collective human consciousness toward that more life-affirming future. I feel that's what life is calling on me right now. And because of the great amount of suffering that is happening in the world right now to our non-human relatives and to our human relatives all around us, this incredible suffering taking place, that the part of me that does identify with that feels that and does not feel at all that it's okay to feel satisfied with whatever place any of us are at right now, but that any of us that are awake to what's going on, really, I feel life is calling on us to engage with others and engage in the most skillful ways we can to try to turn around the trajectory that this civilization is on right now.
Yeah, and you say that in the book, we need communities. And just to end, you actually have your own sort of community. I don't know if you want to talk about that, or if there's anything that I haven't mentioned that you want to be sure people know about, or...
Well, thank you for that. And yes, I guess just to really mention, over the last couple of years, I've actually created an online community, thousands of people from around the world, called the Deep Transformation Network. And this is a community of people who really, the only thing that connects them all is a sense that there is something very wrong in what our civilization is doing and the worldview that we have right now, and a desire to be part of trying to weave together possibilities for a deep transformation within ourselves and with all of society. So there's all kinds of live events that we have, and we have lots of articles and feeds where lots of discussions take place. We have monthly events, we have interactive conversations. So it's a great place to just join if people feel inspired by any of this conversation and want to engage further in these kinds of conversations. Is right there at just www.deeptransformation.network.
Yeah, it's good. It's a great resonance of technology that can be actually healthy. So, well, thanks for all you're doing. Thanks for the books. Thanks for persisting. Thanks for learning and sharing. And thanks for talking to me today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrea. Great conversation. Really enjoyed the places you took us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.